Let me make some introductions, folks. My name is Kelly Clark, and I was with Paul Monis, trial counsel in the underlying case of Kerry Lewis versus the Boy Scouts of America. With me is Gillian Dumas, a partner here who was also heavily involved in the case, Steve Crew, a partner here who is heavily involved in ongoing Boy Scouts cases, and on the phone is Paul Monis, who was also trial counsel in the Kerry Lewis case. So today the Oregon Supreme Court issued its long-awaited decision on the question of whether the secret files of the Boy Scouts regarding child abuse are public record and whether the public has access to them. And the court decided that the trial judge was right, that the documents can and should be released to the public, that the narrow legal ruling was that the Oregon Constitution permits but does not require the trial judge to have reached this ruling. So from a legal standpoint, it was pretty narrow. From a practical standpoint, it means that the battle that we fought to get those documents to begin with, to get them into evidence during the trial, to make sure a jury understood them, and to make sure the public understood what they mean, that long battle is over, and it's a victory for child abuse survivors. At a time where there's a jury meeting as we speak in Philadelphia to consider a cover-up by the Philadelphia Archdiocese, a jury in Pennsylvania is hearing evidence in the Jerry Sandusky case about a potential cover-up at Penn State. In light of the revelations over the last few weeks about the private prep school in New York, the Horace Mann School, and the culture of cover-up there, we read this decision as evidence that society is continuing to say it is not okay for institutions of trust to keep secrets about hidden dangers to children. And we think that this decision reflects that growing consensus, social consensus. I can talk in a few minutes about what this means practically in terms of when you folks will have access to the actual files. There's a number of sort of logistical things that have to happen, practically speaking, before you will actually have physical copies of the files.
Kelly, can I jump in for a second?
Yeah, hang on, Paul. I'm just about finished.
Okay. All right.
Behind me are the 6 boxes of files that were introduced into evidence during the trial. So behind me are the 6 boxes of documents that were introduced into evidence at trial that the jury saw and apparently spent some significant time going through in their deliberations, and that we believe was the centerpiece of their punitive damages verdict. And so I'll stop there, let Paul make his introductory comments, and then see if Steve and Gillian have anything they want to add. Go ahead, Paul.
I think the importance of these files, some people will ask, well, you know, these cases go back to 1965, which is almost 50 years ago, some back at least 30 years ago. Why are they important? And the reason these files are important is not just because of the case against the Boy Scouts, but really to demonstrate that we had a significant problem with abuse in the Scouts, but really nationwide, and it was never documented. And we have to remember, though, these are 1,287 files of perpetrators. They represent well over 2,000 boys, because many of these perpetrators, almost all of them, had multiple victims. And the other thing we have to remember is that most of these boys in these files who are now adult men never will tell anybody that they were victims. They will go to their graves and they will die silently with a terrible secret that has tortured them. These files represent, hopefully for these people who still remain silent, public recognition of the of what happened to them. When many of these files also, you should all know, represent the largest repository of information maintained by an organization on sexual abuse. Nothing, and I mean nothing, the Catholic Church has maintained in all the secret files you've heard about, whether it was the diocese in Portland or the Jesuits, comes close to the kinds of detail that you'll see in these files. And in fact, the fact that the victims' names and the reporters' names are redacted is a good thing. But the most important thing is the value of what's in these files, and it shows how trusted adult leaders took advantage of these young boys and their families, and it provides almost a tutorial for understanding the grooming of young boys and how adults and trusted institutions get away with the abuse. And none of these kids, also most of them who were represented and are now adults in these files, ever filed any lawsuits. 99.9% never filed a lawsuit. They never went to the police. These cases, for many of these kids, it was as if they didn't exist, because there was no policy back at this time to report the sexual abuse to the police departments or law enforcement or child protective services. In fact, for those of you who attended the trial, you'll know when we put this evidence on, in fact, there was evidence of a policy of not reporting to the authorities. And so this is, and we hope that the publication of these documents, it's too late for some of these, obviously, for the victims who've been abused, except to the extent that it hopefully will let them know they weren't alone. But also in the future, we hope that this will make the Boy Scouts a stronger organization and other organizations who serve youth around the country to be more aware of a problem that really, up until recently, the reality is, as much as we say we support kids, state governments, for the most part, really never had the kinds of laws that they really needed to protect kids until very recently. And we still know that around the country, civil statutes of limitations still limit the access to the courts as they do in New York and many other states for victims to seek true justice.
Okay, thanks. Steve or Gillian, you guys want to jump in with any thoughts?
I'd like to follow up on one point that Paul made. It's not a big point, but I think it's important. It wasn't just boys who were the victims of abuse in the Boy Scout program, because in the 1970s, the Boy Scouts opened up their program to girls and started co-ed Explorer Scout troops. So we right now have cases on behalf of many now women who were abused when they were brought into the Boy Scout program. And what these files show is that, in particular to those cases, these files existed for decades before the Boy Scouts allowed girls to come in. And so that makes you think, why, if they had this problem and they knew about it, would they open up their program to the whole other half of the child population? So I think this ruling in Oregon is going to have huge effects, not only for the cases we have for the men who were abused when they were boys, but also for these women who were abused in Boy Scouts.
Steve?
Just briefly to echo what Paul Mona said, I think the message to former Scouts out there that were abused as children, I think the message is, you're not alone, others have been abused, others have come forward, and you will be believed. And probably the most important message we can send to them is, this was not your fault.
Okay. I think we'll stop at this point and start in with questions and maybe clarify some of this as we go.
When did these the files first come to light? I mean, was it in this 2000? No.
No. Historically, there's a couple of places where the files came to light. There was a story in 1935 in the New York Times about the Boy Scouts, quote, red flag files. And rumors had been circulating that the Boy Scouts had these files that they called red flags. And in the anti-communist hysteria of the era, the public and some reporters assumed that that meant that the Boy Scouts were discovering that they had been infiltrated by communists. And so the Boy Scouts went to some lengths to talk to the New York Times and say, no, we don't have a problem with communists. This has to do with child abuse, but not communism. So that was the first time that they sort of publicly acknowledged that these files existed. And then the whole thing went dark again until litigation in the 80s and 90s, where some lawyers began to discover the existence of these files, but by and large were unsuccessful in obtaining them. And then some other lawyers in Seattle and elsewhere, as well as our office in the last decade, began to get copies of the files, or at least portions of the files, under protective orders, very restrictive protective orders. And things being what they are, most of those cases settled before trial. And so the issues of whether they come into evidence or not never got played out. And it was only in the Carrie Lewis trial in 2010 where everything had to be pushed to the limit. And so we had it out on the question of what files do we get, what's their relevance, do they come into evidence, and then the follow-up question presented today of are they or are they not now in the public domain?
Why is it so important for you that these are in the public domain?
Because child abuse thrives in secrecy, and secret systems are its breeding ground. And what the civil litigation of child abuse cases in this country has done in the last 10 years, Catholic Church, Mormon Church, Boy Scouts, Seventh-day Adventist, schools, daycare organizations, what these cases have done has been to show the public that institutions regularly react badly and decide to put their own interests ahead of the interests of kids. And as Paul mentioned, this is probably the best example in terms of a comprehensive set of documents that exists to show the historical problem. But the importance of it now is, look, a jury looked at these files and handed down a nearly $20 million verdict. Significant portions of it were punitive damages. They obviously determined that the answers to the questions of what did the Boy Scouts know, when did they know it, and what did they do about it, was they knew a lot, they knew it a long time ago, and they didn't do much about it. What this ruling does is allow the public to make that determination for itself.
And the relevance of these files is very similar to any organization that maintains files about their perpetrators. We know the church did, but again, when you get a chance to look at these files, you'll see that the detail with which they were put together, by and large, which includes correspondence between individuals. One of the cases we brought out just as an example during the trial was a case of, and this is correspondence between local scout leaders and the national office, where the national office writes to the local scout leader on a question of whether to eject a scout leader was while sleeping in the nude and showing Cub Scouts pornography shows poor judgment. That's no reason to take away this person's registration as an adult leader. I mean, that's a paraphrase, but that's pretty close, I think. We'll agree, right, Kelly?
Yeah, that's pretty close to what it said.
That person was not ejected and ended up staying in the Scouts. And we also know the files will also show a program that the Scouts had, which they no longer have, called probation. Like in this kind of case, I just mentioned to you with the Cub Scouts, where they would not allow, they would get reports of abuse or of what they consider inappropriate behavior of an adult leader and not eject them, let them stay in Scouts and, quote, look at, monitor them, and then these guys would abuse again. And so the files are a treasure trove of how institutions respond. That's as Steve was saying, that's one of the importance of how institutions respond to this. And it's no different than how the Catholic Church responded, or in the cover piece in the New York Times Magazine this past week about how abuse was handled at the exclusive Horace Mann School in New York. So, I mean, I think that when people get a chance to get into these files, and it took our team months to really get through them in detail, you'll see that patterns emerge in how this abuse happened and what was done about it.